3 weeks into my new life as Draven Kale's keeper, I thought I understood the rules of his world, the silent language of violence that spoke in shadows and whispers, the delicate balance between loyalty and fear that kept his empire from crumbling into chaos, the way power moved through the city's veins like poison through a bloodstream. I was wrong about everything, catastrophically and dangerously wrong, and my ignorance was about to cost me more than just the quiet life I had already sacrificed on the altar of curiosity and circumstance. The morning I woke up chained to a chair in an abandoned warehouse with my own blood pooling at my feet, the metallic taste of copper coating my tongue, and the acrid smell of rust and decay filling my nostrils until I could barely breathe, I realized with a bone-deep terror that made my previous fears seem like childhood nightmares, that the Russo family had been playing a much longer, more intricate game than any of us had ever imagined. The cold bite of the metal shackles around my wrists was the first sensation that penetrated the fog of unconsciousness, followed immediately by the nauseating throb of pain that radiated from what felt like every nerve ending in my body, as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to my ribs and then decided to use my skull as an anvil for good measure. My dress, the same midnight blue silk that Draven had bought for me just days ago, when he decided I needed clothes befitting my new role as his partner rather than his captive, was torn and stained with dark patches that I desperately hoped belonged to someone else, but knew with sickening certainty were my own blood, painting abstract patterns across the fabric like some grotesque piece of modern art. The warehouse around me was a tomb of rusted metal and broken dreams, with shafts of pale morning light filtering through the cracked skylights to illuminate the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rhythmic drip of water echoing off the concrete floor, a metronome counting down the seconds of what might very well be the last day of my life. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, fragments of memory began to surface like pieces of a shattered mirror, each one reflecting a different moment from the past 24 hours that had led me to this nightmare. I remembered the warmth of Draven's penthouse at dawn, the way the city had looked spread out below us like a kingdom we ruled together, and how I had been standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of coffee in my hands, feeling for the first time in my adult life like I belonged somewhere, like I had found my place in the world, even if that place happened to be beside a man who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. The coffee had been perfect, rich and dark, with just a hint of vanilla, and Draven had been behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist as we watched the sun paint the skyline in shades of gold and amber, and for those precious few minutes, the violence and danger that defined our existence had seemed as distant and unreal as fairy tales. But fairy tales, as I had learned over the past 3 weeks of living in Draven's world, were luxury items that people like us could never afford. Because in the empire of shadows and secrets that he had built with blood and bullets, there was always someone watching, always someone waiting, always someone planning to tear down everything you had fought to create. Marco Santorini, Draven's lieutenant, and the man I had come to think of as the protective older brother I had never had been the one to suggest I accompany him to the harbor that morning to observe a shipment that Draven suspected might contain more than just the imported olive oil listed on the customs documents. Marco, with his salt and pepper hair and his kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, had seemed like the safest person in Draven's organization, the one member of his inner circle who treated me not as a curiosity or a liability, but as an equal, someone whose insights and observations were valued rather than tolerated. The irony was so bitter it made my throat close up with unshed tears, because I had trusted Marco completely, had felt safe walking beside him through the industrial maze of shipping containers and loading docks, had believed his assurances that this was routine surveillance, nothing more dangerous than watching men move boxes from one place to another. I should have noticed the way his hand kept drifting to the gun beneath his jacket, should have picked up on the tension in his shoulders, and the careful way he scanned the shadows between the towering stacks of cargo, should have realized that his protective demeanor was not the concern of a surrogate brother, but the calculating assessment of a predator preparing to deliver his prey to the slaughter. The attack had happened so fast that my mind had barely had time to process the danger before it was already too late to run, with masked men emerging from behind shipping containers like specters materializing from smoke, their weapons already trained on us before I could even open my mouth to scream. But what had frozen the blood in my veins and stopped my heart in its frantic rhythm was not the sight of the guns or the realization that we were outnumbered and outgunned, but the way Marco had stepped aside with practiced ease, his own weapon remaining holstered as the men surrounded me, his face wearing an expression of regret that looked almost genuine if you didn't know to look for the cold satisfaction hidden in the depths of his eyes. "I'm sorry, Sienna," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of what he wanted me to believe was genuine remorse, though I could hear the carefully rehearsed quality of the words, as if he had practiced this speech in front of a mirror until he could deliver it with just the right amount of convincing emotion. "But some debts run deeper than loyalty, and the Russo family has a very long memory when it comes to settling scores." The betrayal had hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping and disoriented, because in the short time I had been part of Draven's world, I had learned to trust my instincts about people, had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the micro-expressions and subtle body language that revealed truth from deception, and Marco had never once triggered my internal alarm system. The chloroform-soaked cloth that had been pressed over my nose and mouth had smelled sickly sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with medical antiseptic. And as the world had faded to black around the edges, the last thing I had seen was Marco's face, no longer wearing the mask of kindly concern, but revealing the cold, calculating expression of a man who had been playing a role for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The last coherent thought I had before losing consciousness was not fear for my own safety, but a bone-deep terror for what this betrayal would do to Draven, when he discovered that someone he had trusted with his life, someone he had considered family, had sold him out for whatever price the Russos had put on our heads. Now, as I sat chained in this industrial purgatory, with the taste of blood in my mouth and the sound of approaching footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, I found myself thinking not about escape or rescue, but about the systematic way I had been integrated into Draven's organization over the past 3 weeks, how he had taught me to see the patterns that others missed, to notice the small details that could mean the difference between life and death, to think 3 moves ahead in a game where the stakes were always measured in blood and bullets. He had made me his keeper of secrets, his observer of anomalies, the person who watched for the subtle signs of betrayal that his enemies might plant within his ranks. And the cruel irony was that while I had been learning to spot deception in strangers and rivals, I had completely missed the viper that had been coiled in our very midst. The sound of heavy doors sliding open with a metallic shriek that set my teeth on edge announced the arrival of my captors, and I forced myself to lift my head, despite the way the movement sent lightning bolts of agony shooting through my skull, determined to face whatever was coming with the kind of dignity that Draven had taught me was more valuable than gold in a world where weakness was a death sentence. The man who entered the warehouse was not what I had expected. Not the stereotypical thug with scarred knuckles and dead eyes that populated Draven's nightmares and my own imagination, but rather a well-dressed gentleman in an expensive charcoal suit who looked like he could have been attending a board meeting rather than overseeing a kidnapping. Antonio Russo was smaller than I had imagined, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair combed back from a face that would have been handsome if not for the cold cruelty that lived behind his pale blue eyes, and he moved with the measured confidence of a man who had never doubted his own power, never questioned his right to take whatever he wanted from the world, regardless of who might suffer in the process. Behind him walked Marco, no longer bothering to hide his true nature behind the mask of loyalty he had worn so convincingly, his shoulders squared and his chin lifted in defiance of any guilt he might have felt about his betrayal. And seeing him standing there beside my captor like a faithful dog, waiting for praise made my stomach churn with a combination of rage and betrayal that threatened to consume me from the inside out. Miss Sienna Rain, Antonio said, his voice cultured and smooth like aged whiskey, carrying just a hint of an accent that spoke of old-world sophistication and new-world ruthlessness. I do apologize for the rather dramatic circumstances of our introduction, but I'm afraid your association with Mr. Cale has made more traditional meeting arrangements quite impossible. He approached my chair with the unhurried pace of a man who knew I had nowhere to run, no means of escape, no hope of rescue that would arrive in time to prevent whatever he had planned for me. And the casual way he reached out to brush a strand of blood-matted hair away from my face made my skin crawl with revulsion, even as I forced myself not to flinch away from his touch. The smell of his cologne, expensive and cloying, mixed with the metallic scent of my own blood and the musty odor of the warehouse to create a nauseating cocktail that made me want to vomit. But I swallowed down the bile that rose in my throat and met his gaze with all the defiance I could muster, remembering every lesson Draven had taught me about projecting strength even in moments of absolute vulnerability. You see, my dear, Antonio continued, his pale eyes studying my face with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. You have become something of a problem for my organization, not because of anything you have done yourself, but because of what you represent to the man who has claimed you as his own. The way he said the word claimed made it clear that he understood exactly what I meant to Draven, that he had observed and catalogued every moment of tenderness, every gesture of protection, every sign that the infamous Reaper had developed feelings for someone, and that knowledge was now a weapon he intended to wield against both of us with surgical precision. Your Mr. Cale has built quite the reputation for being untouchable, unbreakable, a man who cares for nothing and no one enough to be vulnerable, Antonio said, beginning to pace in a slow circle around my chair, like a predator stalking wounded prey. But you, sweet Sienna, you have given him something that all his enemies have been searching for his entire career, a weakness we can exploit. As he spoke, the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed began to fall into place with horrifying clarity, and I realized that my capture was not the opportunistic grab I had assumed, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months, perhaps even years in the making. The phone call that had started everything, the coat mix-up at the charity gala, even my presence at that event in the first place. None of it had been the random chance I had believed it to be, but rather a series of carefully manipulated events designed to bring me into Draven's orbit and make me indispensable to him, creating the very vulnerability that his enemies could now exploit. You want to know the real beauty of this situation? Antonio asked, his voice taking on the pleased tone of a professor delivering a particularly clever lecture to an appreciative audience, though in this case, his audience consisted of one terrified woman and a handful of armed thugs, who looked like they would rather be anywhere else in the world. Your lover believes that Marco betrayed him for money, for some short-sighted greed that made him willing to sell out his boss for a quick payday. But the truth is so much more elegant than that. He stopped directly in front of me, leaning down until his face was inches from mine, close enough that I could see the network of fine lines around his eyes and smell the mint on his breath that couldn't quite disguise the underlying scent of decay that seemed to emanate from his very soul. Marco has been mine for over 2 years, ever since we discovered certain financial irregularities in his personal life that made him susceptible to our particular brand of persuasion, Antonio revealed, the words hitting me like physical blows as I realized the full scope of the deception that had been perpetrated against us. Every piece of information he fed to Draven, every bit of intelligence that seemed to give your organization an advantage over ours, every successful operation that made Draven believe he was winning this war, all of it was carefully crafted to lead us to this moment when we could take away the one thing that matters to him more than his own life. The sound of my own heartbeat was so loud in my ears that it almost drowned out Antonio's voice, a frantic drumming that seemed to echo off the warehouse walls and announce to everyone present just how terrified I was, despite my efforts to maintain some semblance of composure in the face of this revelation. But beneath the fear, beneath the bone-deep understanding that I was likely going to die in this place, there was something else growing. Something dark and cold and furious that felt remarkably like the rage I had seen burning in Draven's eyes when he spoke of his enemies. And I found myself wondering if this was how monsters were born, not through choice, but through the systematic destruction of everything soft and innocent and trusting that had once lived inside them. "The question now," Antonio said, straightening up and smoothing his tie with the casual gesture of a man who had just ordered coffee rather than outlined a plan for psychological torture, "is whether you are going to cooperate with us voluntarily, or whether we are going to have to extract the information we need through less pleasant means, though I should warn you that my methods of persuasion have proven quite effective over the years, and I would hate to mar such a pretty face unnecessarily." Before I could formulate a response that would neither reveal how absolutely terrified I was, nor provoke him into demonstrating just how effective his methods could be, the sound of a phone ringing cut through the tension-filled air of the warehouse, and I watched Antonio's face transform from predatory satisfaction to sharp, focused attention as he pulled a sleek black device from his jacket pocket and glanced at the caller ID. Whatever he saw there made him smile, a cold, cruel expression that promised pain and suffering for someone, and when he answered the call and put it on speaker, the voice that poured from the device froze the blood in my veins and made my heart stop beating for what felt like an eternity. "I have something that belongs to you, Cale," Antonio said into the phone, his eyes never leaving my face as he spoke. "And unless you want to receive her back in pieces, I suggest you listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because this conversation is going to determine whether your precious little book restorer sees another sunrise or becomes just another casualty in a war that should have ended years ago. Your father destroyed my family 20 years ago, little Judge's daughter, and now I'm going to destroy his." Antonio Russo's words sliced through the stale air of the warehouse like a blade, designed specifically to carve out my heart and leave it bleeding on the concrete floor. Because in that single, devastating sentence, he had stripped away not just the illusion of anonymity I had been clinging to since this nightmare began, but also the carefully constructed lie I had been telling myself about who I really was and why the universe had conspired to thrust me into Draven Cale's dangerous orbit. The phone call with Draven had ended abruptly after Antonio's taunting declaration, but not before I had heard the sound of glass shattering in the background, followed by a string of profanity so vicious and creative that it would have made a sailor blush. And I knew without being told that my captor had just lit a fuse that would burn through the city until it reached the powder keg of Draven's rage and exploded in a conflagration of violence that would leave bodies scattered across 3 boroughs. My mind reeled with the implications of Antonio's revelation, because the name Rain was not particularly uncommon, and I had spent years convincing myself that my father's position as a federal judge was too far removed from the world of organized crime to put me in any real danger. A naive assumption that now seemed laughable in its ignorance of how long and vindictive the memories of powerful men could be, when they felt their honor or their legacy had been trampled underfoot by the grinding wheels of what they perceived to be an unjust legal system. Federal Judge Thomas Rain, my father, the man who had raised me on bedtime stories about justice and righteousness, who had taught me that the law was a sacred trust designed to protect the innocent and punish the wicked, who had sacrificed countless family dinners and weekend outings to the demands of his courtroom, had apparently made an enemy so implacable and so patient that 20 years had not been enough to cool the fires of his desire for revenge. "You're wondering how I know, aren't you?" Antonio asked, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a chess master who had just revealed a strategy that had been developing for dozens of moves, and he gestured to one of his men. A hulking brute with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone with only a passing familiarity with human anatomy, who stepped forward carrying a manila folder, thick with what appeared to be surveillance photographs and official documents. "I've been watching you for months, Sienna Rain, learning your routines, your habits, your vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect opportunity to use you as the weapon that would finally bring down the man who sent my father to die in a federal penitentiary for crimes that every family in this city commits on a daily basis without so much as a slap on the wrist. The photographs that spilled from the folder when he upended it onto a rusted metal table were like looking at my life through the eyes of a stalker. Images captured with telephoto lenses from hidden vantage points that showed me walking to work at the library, sitting alone in coffee shops with my nose buried in restoration manuals, grocery shopping on Sunday mornings when the streets were quiet, and I could pretend that I was just another anonymous face in the crowd, rather than the daughter of one of the most powerful federal judges in the northeastern United States. But it was the older photographs, the ones that had clearly been taken years ago when I was still living under my father's roof and attending university under the protection of his name and reputation, that made my blood run cold and my stomach clench with a nausea that had nothing to do with my physical injuries and everything to do with the realization that I had never truly been free, never truly been safe, never truly been anything more than a pawn waiting to be sacrificed in a game I hadn't even known was being played. Judge Thomas Rain presided over the trial of Salvatore Russo, my beloved father, in 2004. Antonio continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone that people usually reserved for discussing saints or war heroes, though in this case, the object of his devotion had been a man whose empire had been built on extortion, murder, and the systematic corruption of everything decent and honest in the world. The federal prosecutors painted him as a monster, a criminal mastermind who deserved to spend the rest of his life locked in a cage like an animal. But they didn't understand that he was a visionary, a man who saw the potential for greatness in a city that had been abandoned by politicians and police who cared more about their own advancement than the welfare of the people they were supposed to serve. The way Antonio spoke about his father's conviction made it clear that he had never accepted the verdict, had never acknowledged that the evidence against Salvatore Russo had been overwhelming and incontrovertible, had never understood that the law was not a negotiable entity that could be bent to serve the interests of those with enough money and influence to purchase their own version of justice. Instead, he had spent the last 2 decades nursing his grievances like precious heirlooms, polishing his resentment until it gleamed with the cold brilliance of obsidian, and planning a revenge so elaborate and so perfectly calibrated that it would not simply destroy his enemies, but would make them suffer in ways that matched the depth of his own pain and loss. My father died in that federal prison after serving only 8 years of his life sentence, killed by inmates who had been paid by rivals who wanted to ensure that he would never regain his position at the head of our organization, Antonio said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion that sounded genuine for the first time since he had entered the warehouse. And I could see the boy he had once been hiding behind the mask of sophisticated cruelty he wore so convincingly, the son, who had watched his hero and role model be dragged away in shackles, and had sworn an oath of vengeance that had shaped every decision he had made since that day. But before he died, he made me promise that I would find a way to make Judge Thomas Rain pay for what he had done, not just to our family, but to the natural order of things that had kept this city functioning long before federal agents and ambitious prosecutors decided they knew better than the men who had built their empires with blood and sweat and sacrifice. The irony was so bitter it made my throat close up with unshed tears, because my father had never spoken about the Russo trial in my presence, had never brought his work home in a way that would have prepared me for the possibility that his decisions from the bench could follow me into my adult life like vengeful ghosts seeking retribution for perceived injustices. I had grown up believing that his position as a federal judge made him a guardian of justice rather than a target for those who saw justice as nothing more than an inconvenience to be circumvented or a weakness to be exploited. And the realization that my quiet, scholarly existence had been nothing more than an elaborate illusion designed to keep me unaware of the dangers that surrounded me was almost as devastating as the physical pain radiating through my battered body. The beautiful thing about revenge, when it's properly planned and patiently executed, is that it doesn't simply hurt the target. It destroys everything they hold dear, everything they believe in, everything they think makes their life worth living. Antonio explained, beginning to pace around my chair again with the measured steps of a professor delivering a lecture on the finer points of psychological warfare. Your father sent mine to die in a concrete box, so I decided that turnabout was fair play. But I wanted to be creative about it, wanted to make sure that Thomas Rain understood exactly what he was losing, and why he was losing it before I finally granted him the mercy of joining his victim in the grave. The plan that Antonio outlined with obvious pride was so intricate and so carefully orchestrated that it took my breath away. Not because of its brilliance, but because of the sheer amount of time and resources he had invested in destroying a family he had never met, for crimes that existed only in his own twisted perception of justice and injustice. The charity gala where I had made my fateful coat exchange had not been a random social event that I had attended on a whim, but rather a carefully orchestrated trap designed to put me in proximity to the criminal underworld that my father had spent his career fighting against. And the accidental mix-up that had started everything had been anything but accidental. Marco was supposed to ensure that you picked up the correct coat, the one that contained the phone and the gun, and all the other props necessary to convince Draven that you were his missing informant, Antonio revealed, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction as he watched the pieces of the puzzle fall into place in my mind. But you surprised us by being so quick to act, so willing to walk into danger for the sake of returning what you thought was someone else's property, and we realized that your natural curiosity and your innate sense of responsibility would serve our purposes even better than our original plan, because it would make your integration into Draven's world seem completely organic and unforced. The months of surveillance that had preceded my capture had not been random or opportunistic, but had been designed to map every aspect of my personality and my behavior, to identify the psychological triggers that would make me most likely to react in the ways that would serve their ultimate goal of bringing me into contact with Draven Kale, and making me important enough to him that my capture would serve as the perfect weapon to destroy him. They had studied me like a laboratory specimen, cataloging my habits and my preferences and my fears, learning exactly how to manipulate the circumstances of my life to create the illusion of choice while actually guiding me inexorably toward the trap they had spent years constructing. The truly beautiful part of this plan, Antonio continued, his voice taking on the dreamy quality of an artist describing his masterpiece, is that Draven has no idea that his feelings for you were engineered, that every moment of tenderness and every gesture of protection was the result of carefully manipulated circumstances designed to make him fall in love with you so completely that losing you would be worse than dying, because men like Draven Kale are not supposed to have weaknesses, are not supposed to care about anything more than their own power and survival, and the fact that we have given him something to lose means that we have already won this war. The sound of my own breathing was loud, in the silence that followed Antonio's revelation, a ragged, desperate rhythm that seemed to echo off the warehouse walls and announce to everyone present just how close I was to complete psychological collapse, because the realization that my relationship with Draven had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation was almost more devastating than the physical pain radiating through my battered body. But even as the despair threatened to overwhelm me, even as I felt the walls of my sanity beginning to crack under the pressure of these terrible truths, there was something else growing in the darkness of my mind, something cold and hard and utterly unforgiving that felt like the first stirrings of a rage that could burn down the world if properly channeled and directed. You want to know the real reason I'm telling you all of this? Sharing the intimate details of a plan that took years to develop and millions of dollars to execute? Antonio asked, leaning down until his face was inches from mine, close enough that I could see the network of broken capillaries in his eyes, and smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of decay and corruption that seemed to emanate from his very soul. It's because I want you to understand exactly what you've cost your father, exactly what your foolish curiosity and your pathetic need to be helpful have brought down on the head of the man who raised you. Because by the time this is over, Thomas Rain will wish that he had never been born, let alone appointed to the federal bench. The plan that Antonio outlined for my father's destruction was so comprehensive and so methodical that it made me realize I was dealing with a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond anything I had imagined possible. Because this was not simply about revenge for an old conviction, but about the systematic dismantling of everything that my father had worked to build over the course of his distinguished career. They intended to frame him for judicial corruption, to plant evidence that would suggest he had been taking bribes from the very criminal organizations he had spent his life prosecuting, to destroy his reputation so thoroughly that his name would become synonymous with everything corrupt and venal about the American justice system. And the beautiful thing is that we're going to use his love for you as the weapon that destroys him, Antonio said, his smile widening into something that was less human expression than predatory display. Because when we send him the video of what we're going to do to his precious daughter, when we show him exactly how much you're suffering because of his decisions from 20 years ago, he'll be so desperate to save you that he'll confess to crimes he never committed and destroy his own legacy with his own hands. And then, when we're satisfied that his reputation is in ruins and his life's work is nothing more than ash and memory, we'll kill you both. Anyway, because mercy is for people who understand the natural order of things, and your family has proven that you're too stupid and too self-righteous to learn your place in the world. But as Antonio spoke, as he outlined the full scope of his plan for destroying not just me but everything I held dear, I felt something shifting deep inside my chest, something that had nothing to do with fear or despair, and everything to do with the cold, calculating fury that I had seen burning in Draven's eyes when he spoke of his enemies. And I realized with a clarity that cut through the pain and the terror like a blade through silk, that I was no longer the quiet book restorer who had stumbled into this nightmare by accident, but something else entirely. Something that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and violence and emerged harder and sharper and infinitely more dangerous than anything these men could possibly imagine. The sound that came from my throat was not the whimper of a victim or the sob of a broken woman, but something else entirely. A low, dangerous growl that seemed to surprise even me with its intensity. And when I lifted my head to meet Antonio's gaze, I saw my own reflection in his pale blue eyes, and realized that the innocent girl who had answered the wrong phone call had died somewhere between the warehouse and this moment, replaced by someone who understood that in a world where weakness was a death sentence, the only way to survive was to become something that even monsters feared. You made one critical mistake in all your careful planning, Antonio, I said, my voice steady despite the pain radiating through my body and the chains that bound my wrists to the chair. And I had the satisfaction of seeing uncertainty flicker across his features for the first time since he had entered the warehouse. You assumed that breaking me would break Draven. But what you don't understand is that the woman you kidnapped this morning is not the same woman sitting in this chair right now, because you've just taught me everything I need to know about how your mind works, how your organization functions, and most importantly, how much you have to lose when the Reaper comes calling. And trust me when I tell you that he is coming. And when he gets here, your careful plans and your patient revenge are going to seem like children's games compared to what he's going to do to everyone who dared to touch what belongs to him. The sound of Draven's voice echoing through the warehouse wasn't salvation. It was the herald of an apocalypse that would paint the walls crimson and leave no enemy breathing. And as his words cut through the industrial gloom with the precision of a blade designed specifically for carving through bone and sinew, I felt something deep inside my chest uncoil like a serpent that had been sleeping in the darkness of my soul, waiting for this exact moment to strike with all the accumulated venom of betrayal and rage and the terrible knowledge that the man I had come to love was about to transform this place into a graveyard where mercy would be buried alongside anyone foolish enough to stand between him and what he considered his own. Antonio Russo! Draven's voice boomed from speakers hidden throughout the cavernous space, the sound system that my captors had undoubtedly installed to amplify their victims' screams, now serving as the delivery mechanism for a promise of retribution, so absolute and so final that even the hardened criminals surrounding me shifted nervously and reached for weapons that would prove as useful as paper shields against the storm that was about to break over their heads. The transformation that came over Antonio's face was like watching a confident predator suddenly realize that it had wandered into the territory of an apex hunter, because the smug satisfaction that had been radiating from him, like heat from a forge, was instantly replaced by the kind of cold, calculating fear that comes from understanding that all of your careful plans and elaborate schemes have just crumbled into ash, and that the only thing standing between you and a death so violent it would make seasoned killers wake up screaming is whatever pitiful defenses you can cobble together in the few precious seconds before the hammer falls. "You have something that belongs to me," Draven continued, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made grown men drop to their knees and beg for forgiveness they would never receive. "And I'm going to take it back, along with the life of every man who dared to put his hands on her, because in my world there are certain lines that cannot be crossed without consequences, and you crossed them all the moment you decided that Sienna Rain was a weapon you could use against me." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impending violence, thick and oppressive like the air before a thunderstorm, and I could hear the rapid breathing of the men around me as they struggled to maintain their composure in the face of a threat that transcended anything they had experienced in their violent careers, because Draven Kale was not just another crime boss or territorial rival, but something far more dangerous. He was a man who had built his empire on the fundamental principle that love was weakness, and attachment was vulnerability. And the fact that he was about to tear down half the city to retrieve one woman meant that he had discovered something worth dying for, which made him infinitely more lethal than any enemy they had ever faced. Antonio barked orders at his men, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain command in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. And I watched as they scattered throughout the warehouse like cockroaches when the lights come on, taking defensive positions behind shipping containers and loading equipment that would provide about as much protection against Draven's wrath as tissue paper against a hurricane. But I wasn't watching the panicked scramble of Antonio's soldiers or listening to his increasingly desperate attempts to coordinate a defense that we all knew was doomed to failure, because my attention was entirely focused on the subtle changes in the warehouse's acoustics and lighting that told me Draven wasn't coming alone, but was bringing with him the full might of his organization, every soldier and enforcer and stone-cold killer who owed him their loyalty and their lives, and they were moving through the building with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from years of training and the absolute certainty that their leader's enemies would not survive to see another sunrise. The first explosion came from somewhere near the main entrance, a thunderous boom that shook the entire structure and sent clouds of dust and debris raining down from the corrugated metal ceiling, followed immediately by the distinctive chatter of automatic weapons, fire, and the screams of men who had suddenly realized that they were not the hunters in this scenario, but the prey. The battle that erupted around me was unlike anything I could have imagined. Not the Hollywood choreography of action movies where heroes dodge bullets with supernatural grace and villains fall down cleanly when shot, but the raw, chaotic brutality of professional killers who understood that violence was not an art form, but a science, and they practiced their craft with the kind of methodical efficiency that comes from years of experience in turning human beings into corpses with the minimum expenditure of time and ammunition. Draven's men moved through the warehouse like a plague of locusts, systematic and relentless, cutting down Antonio's defenders with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. And I found myself thinking with a clarity that surprised me that this was what it looked like when a man who had built his reputation on being untouchable decided that something was worth touching, worth protecting, worth killing for. Through the smoke and the chaos, and the increasingly desperate gunfire, I caught glimpses of Draven himself moving through the carnage like a force of nature made manifest in human form, his black suit somehow still immaculate despite the blood that splattered across his face and hands as he carved a path through his enemies with a combination of surgical precision and primal savagery that made it clear why men crossed themselves when they spoke his name in whispers. He moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the lethal intent of a serpent, every shot perfectly placed. every movement calculated to bring him closer to his objective. And that objective was not victory or territory, or even revenge in the traditional sense, but something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. The retrieval of something he considered his own from people who had been foolish enough to take it. The man who reached me first was not Draven, but one of Antonio's remaining soldiers, a wild-eyed gunman with blood streaming down his face from a scalp wound, who had apparently decided that his best chance of survival lay in using me as a human shield. And as he pressed the barrel of his pistol against my temple, with hands that shook from adrenaline and terror, I felt a strange calm descend over me. Not the resigned acceptance of someone who had given up hope, but the crystalline clarity that comes from understanding that you are about to witness something that will fundamentally change your perception of what human beings are capable of when properly motivated. "Stay back or she dies," the gunman screamed into the smoky air, his voice cracking with desperation as he tried to use me as leverage against a man who had already demonstrated that he was willing to burn the entire city to ash, if that's what it took to get me back. And I almost felt sorry for him because he clearly didn't understand that. Threatening the thing Draven cared about most was not a negotiating tactic, but a death sentence delivered with the kind of finality that even God would respect. Draven emerged from the smoke and shadows like a nightmare given physical form, his dark eyes fixed on the gun pressed against my head with the kind of focused intensity that could have melted steel. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet and so controlled that it was somehow more terrifying than any shout or roar could have been, because it carried the promise of violence so absolute and so personal that it transcended mere revenge and entered the realm of existential annihilation. "Take your hands off her," he said, each word carefully enunciated and delivered with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. "And I'll kill you quickly. But if you hurt her, if you cause her even 1 second of additional pain, I will keep you alive for days while I explore every possible way that the human body can experience agony, and when I'm finished with you, what's left won't even qualify as human remains." The gunman's response was exactly what I expected from a man who had just realized that he was holding a tiger by the tail. He tightened his grip on the weapon and pressed it harder against my skull, which was precisely the wrong thing to do when dealing with someone like Draven Kale, because men like him don't negotiate with terrorists, or compromise with kidnappers, or show mercy to anyone who threatens what belongs to them. And the shot that ended the gunman's life came not from Draven himself, but from one of his snipers positioned somewhere in the rafters above us. A single bullet that entered through the man's left eye and exited through the back of his skull in a spray of blood and brain matter that painted the wall behind us in abstract patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been composed of human remains. As the dead man's body crumpled to the floor beside my chair, Draven was already moving, crossing the distance between us with long, purposeful strides that ate up the space like he was walking through his own domain, rather than a battlefield strewn with corpses and slick with blood. And when he reached me, when he dropped to one knee beside my chair, and his hands touched my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who had just orchestrated the systematic slaughter of 24 armed men, I felt something break apart inside my chest. Not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that I was safe, that I was protected, that I belonged to someone who would literally move heaven and earth to bring me home. "I'm here, little bird," he murmured against my ear as his fingers worked at the chains that bound my wrists to the chair, his voice rough with an emotion that went deeper than anger or even love, but touched something primal and possessive that lived at the very core of his being, and I could feel the tremor in his hands as he fought to control the rage that was still burning through him like acid in his veins, the need for violence that demanded satisfaction, but was held in check by the more immediate necessity of getting me to safety. "I'm here, and nothing is going to hurt you ever again, because I'm going to make sure that everyone who even thought about touching you understands what happens when they mistake kindness for weakness and assume that love makes a man soft instead of infinitely more dangerous than he was before he had something worth protecting." But even as Draven freed me from the physical restraints that had held me captive, even as his arms wrapped around me with a protective fierce that made me feel like I was being embraced by a living fortress. I could see over his shoulder that our troubles were far from over, because Antonio Russo had not fled with his remaining men, but had instead retreated to a defensive position near the back of the warehouse, and he was holding something in his hands that made my blood run cold and my heart skip several beats in rapid succession. Not a weapon, but a dead man's switch connected to what appeared to be enough explosive charges to bring down the entire building and everyone in it, including the man who had just declared war on the entire underworld for the sake of one woman who had answered the wrong phone call and found herself at the center of a conflict that had been brewing for 20 years. "You want her so badly, Kale?" Antonio screamed across the warehouse, his voice echoing off the metal walls with a hysteria that suggested he had finally snapped under the pressure of watching his carefully laid plans crumble into ruin around him. "Then you can die together. Because if I can't have my revenge against Judge Thomas Rain, then I'll settle for taking his daughter and the man who stole her from me straight to hell. And maybe when you're both burning in the flames of damnation, you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything you care about in a single moment of violence and betrayal." The silence that followed Antonio's threat was pregnant with the kind of tension that makes time itself seem to slow down and stretch like taffy. And as I looked into Draven's eyes, I saw not fear or panic, but the cold, calculating expression of a predator who had just been presented with a puzzle that required a very specific kind of solution. And I realized with a mixture of terror and anticipation that the war we thought was ending was actually just beginning, because men like Antonio Russo don't go quietly into the night, and the dead man's switch in his hands meant that the next few minutes would determine whether we walked out of this warehouse as victors or whether we all went down together in a blaze of fire and twisted metal that would serve as our mutual tomb. "If you want to survive in my world, Sienna, you need to stop thinking like prey and start thinking like a predator." Draven's words echoed through the steel-reinforced walls of the new safe house 3 days after our escape from Antonio's warehouse. The memory of that dead man's switch and the explosion that had nearly claimed our lives still fresh enough in my mind that I could taste the smoke and feel the heat of the flames that had consumed everything behind us as we'd fled through a service tunnel that Draven's advance team had prepared for exactly this kind of scenario. The safe house itself was a fortress disguised as a derelict apartment building on the outskirts of the industrial district. Its crumbling exterior hiding reinforced walls, bulletproof windows, and enough firepower to outfit a small army. And it was here, in the converted basement that served as both armory and training facility, that Draven had begun the systematic process of transforming me from the woman who had been chained to a chair just days earlier into something that could stand beside him as an equal rather than hide behind him as a liability. The weight of the Glock 19 in my hands felt alien and terrifying at first, the cold metal seeming to burn against my palms as if the weapon itself understood that I was a fraud, an imposter trying to play at being something I had never been designed to be. But Draven's hands covering mine as he adjusted my grip and corrected my stance were steady and patient, his voice a low rumble of encouragement and instruction that gradually began to make sense of the chaos of muscle memory and breathing techniques and sight alignment that would eventually, he promised, become as natural as the way I had once handled delicate manuscripts and restoration tools. "Your father's enemies aren't going to wait for you to feel comfortable with violence, little bird," he murmured against my ear as I squeezed the trigger for the 100th time that afternoon, the target's downrange bearing the bullet holes that marked my slowly improving accuracy, like constellations mapping the geography of my transformation from scholar to soldier. And if you're going to survive what's coming next, you need to understand that hesitation is the difference between going home to the people you love and becoming another casualty in a war that started long before you were born. The revelation that my father had been receiving death threats for weeks, that federal marshals were now stationed outside his courtroom and his home, that the carefully ordered world of justice and jurisprudence that had shaped my entire childhood was now under siege from the same forces that had tried to use me as a weapon against Draven, had filled me with a rage so pure and so focused that it cut through my remaining qualms about embracing the violence that seemed to be my inheritance as Thomas Rain's daughter and Draven Kale's woman. Antonio Russo's escape from the warehouse explosion had been confirmed by Draven's intelligence network, which meant that the threat to both my father and myself was still very much alive, still breathing, still planning whatever fresh hell he intended to unleash in his quest for a revenge that had already cost too many innocent lives and destroyed too many families to be satisfied with anything less than total annihilation of everyone who bore the Rain or Kale names. The beautiful thing about fear, Draven said as he guided me through hand-to-hand combat techniques that were designed not for sport or self-defense, but for the kind of close-quarters killing that left no room for mercy or second chances. His body moving with the fluid grace of a man who had been dealing death with his bare hands since he was old enough to understand that survival was not guaranteed, but earned through superior skill and absolute ruthlessness, is that it can be transformed into something much more useful if you learn how to channel it properly. Because the woman who is afraid of dying will always lose to the woman who is more afraid of losing the people she loves than she is of becoming a killer herself. His hands on my body as he demonstrated chokeholds and pressure points, and the dozen different ways to incapacitate a man without making a sound were simultaneously educational and electric, sending currents of awareness through my nervous system that had nothing to do with the lessons he was teaching, and everything to do with the way my body had begun to respond to his touch, even in circumstances that should have been purely professional and tactical. The kiss happened during a break between training sessions, when we were both sweaty and exhausted and running on nothing but adrenaline and caffeine and the kind of desperate energy that comes from knowing that time is running out and that every moment spent preparing for war is a moment stolen from whatever future we might have together if we manage to survive the next few days. I had been cleaning my weapon, my hands moving through the disassembly and maintenance routine with the growing confidence of someone who was finally beginning to understand the tools of her new trade, when Draven had moved up behind me, his chest pressed against my back as he reached around to correct my technique. And something about the intimacy of that moment, the way his breath felt against my neck and his heartbeat thundered against my spine, had made me turn in his arms without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences of what I was about to do. The taste of him was like nothing I had ever experienced, dark and dangerous and addictive in a way that made me understand why people talked about losing themselves in another person. Because kissing Draven Kale was not the sweet, tentative exploration of two people getting to know each other, but the collision of two souls that had been forged in the same fires of violence and betrayal, and had emerged hardened and desperate, and absolutely certain that whatever time they had together was worth any price they might have to pay for it. His hands tangled in my hair as he deepened the kiss, pulling me against him with a possession that spoke of claim and ownership, and the kind of primitive need that civilized people pretended didn't exist. And I could taste gunpowder and whiskey and the metallic edge of violence on his lips, could feel the barely controlled power in his body as he held me like I was something precious and fragile and infinitely breakable. "You're mine, Sienna Rain," he whispered against my mouth when we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard and staring at each other with the kind of intensity that could have ignited the air between us, his dark eyes burning with an emotion that went deeper than desire and touched something fundamental about possession and protection, and the absolute certainty that he would tear the world apart before he let anyone take me away from him again. Not because I claimed you, not because circumstances threw us together, not because you had no choice in the matter, but because you chose this, chose me, chose to become something dangerous and beautiful and absolutely lethal. And now that you've made that choice, there's no going back to the woman who answered the wrong phone call because she doesn't exist anymore. The plan that we developed over the next 2 days was both elegant and absolutely terrifying in its scope, because it involved using my father's upcoming ruling on the Romano racketeering case as bait to draw Antonio out of whatever hole he had crawled into after the warehouse explosion, knowing that his obsession with destroying the Rain family would override any sense of caution or self-preservation he might have retained. The federal courthouse where my father presided was a fortress of marble and steel, surrounded by enough security to protect a head of state. But Draven's contacts within law enforcement had revealed that Antonio's network included people with access to the building, people who could disable security systems and provide intelligence about the movements of federal marshals and the schedules of judges and their families. "He's going to come for your father during the Romano sentencing," Draven said, as we studied the architectural blueprints of the courthouse that his people had somehow acquired, his finger tracing the routes that Antonio's team would most likely use to infiltrate the building and reach the courtroom where my father would be completely vulnerable despite all the protection surrounding him. But what he doesn't know is that we're going to be waiting for him. And this time, when the shooting starts, there won't be any dead man switches or escape tunnels or elaborate schemes to cheat death, because I'm going to put a bullet in his brain myself and watch the light go out of his eyes. And then this war that started with your father's gavel is finally going to end with my gun. The weight of the engagement ring that Draven slipped onto my finger that night was more than just the physical presence of platinum and diamonds, more than just a symbol of commitment or a promise of forever. Because in his world, in our world now, marriage was not just a declaration of love, but a political alliance. A merger of two damaged souls who had found in each other the strength to face whatever hell was waiting for them beyond the walls of our temporary sanctuary. "When this is over," he promised, as he held me in the darkness of our shared bed, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, and the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from loving someone so completely that their pain becomes your pain, and their survival becomes more important than your own. "When Antonio is dead and your father is safe and the Russo family is nothing but a memory written in blood on the pages of history, I'm going to marry you in a church with white flowers and witnesses who aren't carrying guns, and we're going to have a honeymoon somewhere that doesn't have bulletproof windows. And for at least a few days, we're going to pretend that we're just two people who fell in love instead of two weapons that were forged in the same fire and tempered by the same violence." But as I lay there in his arms, listening to the sound of his heartbeat and feeling the warmth of his body against mine, I found myself thinking not about the peaceful future he was promising, but about the woman I had become over the past few weeks. The woman who could field strip a weapon blindfolded and plan an ambush with the same methodical attention to detail that she had once brought to restoring damaged manuscripts. And I realized with a mixture of pride and terror that I didn't want to go back to being the innocent book restorer who had stumbled into this nightmare by accident, because that woman had been weak and naive and completely unprepared for the realities of a world where justice was not dispensed by judges in robes, but by people like us who understood that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become something that even monsters fear. Standing in my father's courtroom, wearing body armor beneath my dress, and Draven's ring on my finger, I watched Antonio Russo walk through the doors and knew that only one of us would leave alive. Because the woman who had answered the wrong phone call 6 weeks ago had been buried in the ashes of a warehouse explosion, and replaced by someone who understood that justice was not always dispensed from behind a mahogany bench by men in black robes, but sometimes required the kind of personal intervention that left blood on marble floors and silence where there had once been threats. The federal courthouse had been transformed into a killing field disguised as a temple of justice, with Draven's snipers positioned in the gallery among the carefully screened spectators, his men stationed at every entrance and exit wearing the uniforms of court security, and me sitting in the front row where Antonio would see me the moment he entered. The bait in a trap that had been months in the making and would end with either his death or mine, because there was no longer room in this world for both of us to exist. My father, federal judge Thomas Rain, sat behind his bench with the kind of dignity that had defined his entire career, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights, and his weathered hands steady as he prepared to deliver the sentence that would send Vincent Romano away for the rest of his natural life, completely unaware that his courtroom had become a battlefield and that his daughter was about to commit murder in the name of justice that the law had proven incapable of delivering. The wire I wore beneath my silk blouse was transmitting every word to Draven, who was positioned in the courthouse basement with enough firepower to level half the building if things went wrong, and the small pistol strapped to my thigh beneath my skirt felt like both a promise and a prayer. Because I had trained for this moment until muscle memory had replaced conscious thought, and the weight of the weapon had become as familiar as the feel of my own heartbeat against my ribs. When Antonio entered the courtroom, flanked by two men who were trying very hard to look like legitimate spectators rather than the stone-cold killers they actually were, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of impending violence, and I felt something cold and predatory uncoil in my chest as I met his pale blue eyes across the crowded room and saw the moment of recognition followed immediately by the kind of satisfaction that comes from finally cornering prey that has been running for far too long. He had aged in the weeks since our last encounter, his silver hair now showing streaks of gray, and his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on a frame that had been worn down by stress and the constant pressure of being hunted by the most dangerous man in the city. But his eyes still burned with the same fanatical determination that had driven him to orchestrate this entire nightmare, and I knew that he would rather die in this courtroom than walk away without claiming the revenge that had consumed the last 20 years of his life. The Romano sentencing proceeded with all the formal pageantry that the federal justice system could muster, my father's voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he delivered a life sentence that would ensure Vincent Romano died behind bars. But I wasn't listening to the words because my entire focus was concentrated on Antonio and the way his hands kept moving toward the inside of his jacket, where I knew he carried the same kind of weapon that had been pressed against my temple in that warehouse, and I could feel Draven's presence through the wire like a physical force, his breathing steady and controlled as he waited for the signal that would turn this courtroom into a slaughterhouse, where justice would finally be served with the kind of finality that appeals courts and constitutional protections could never overturn. "Your Honor," Antonio said, rising from his seat in the gallery, with the kind of theatrical confidence that suggested he had been rehearsing this moment in his mind for decades, his voice cutting through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom like a blade designed specifically for destroying the illusion of civilized justice. "Before you conclude today's proceedings, I believe there's something you should know about your daughter and the company she's been keeping since she decided to involve herself in matters that were none of her concern." The gasps that rippled through the courtroom were nothing compared to the look of shocked recognition that crossed my father's face as he saw me for the first time since this nightmare had begun, his eyes taking in the changes that 6 weeks of violence and transformation had wrought in his quiet, scholarly daughter. And I could see the exact moment when he understood that the woman sitting in his courtroom was no longer the girl who had once helped him grade law school exams and believed that justice was something that could be measured in precedents and properly applied statutes. "Sienna Rain has become the whore of the most dangerous criminal in this city," Antonio continued, his voice rising with the kind of righteous indignation that only the truly delusional could muster when describing their own victims. "And her association with Draven Kale has made her complicit in murder, extortion, and every other crime that your precious justice system is supposed to prevent. Which means that the daughter you raised to respect the law has become everything you spent your career fighting against." The security guards were already moving toward Antonio, their hands reaching for weapons that would never clear their holsters in time, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when all the training and preparation and psychological conditioning would either save my life or prove inadequate against a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of revenge. The gun in Antonio's hand appeared with the kind of practiced speed that spoke of years of violence and countless previous killings. But I was already moving, my body responding to muscle memory and instinct as I drew my own weapon and felt the familiar weight of it settle into my grip, like it belonged there. Like it had always belonged there. Like I had been born to hold death in my hands and dispense it with the kind of surgical precision that Draven had taught me during those long nights in the safe house, when he had transformed me from prey into predator. The shot that ended Antonio Russo's life came from my gun, not from the snipers in the gallery or the men stationed at the exits, but from the woman who had once restored damaged books and now understood that some things were too broken to be repaired and needed to be destroyed completely before they could hurt anyone else. The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute and profound, broken only by the sound of Antonio's body hitting the marble floor and the metallic echo of my pistol clattering beside his corpse. And as I looked at what I had done, at the man whose obsession with revenge had finally met its match in someone who loved more fiercely than he had ever hated, I felt not horror or regret, but a strange sense of completion, as if some fundamental equation had finally been balanced, and the universe could return to its proper alignment. My father was staring at me from behind his bench, with an expression that combined shock and recognition, and something that might have been pride if he could bring himself to be proud of a daughter who had just committed murder in his courtroom. And when federal marshals surrounded me with weapons drawn and voices shouting commands that seemed to come from very far away, I kept my hands visible and my eyes fixed on the judge who had raised me to believe in justice, even if the justice I had just delivered bore no resemblance to anything they taught in law school. The investigation that followed would eventually clear me of any wrongdoing, the security footage and witness testimony establishing beyond doubt that I had acted in defense of my father's life and my own, that Antonio Russo had entered the courtroom with the intention of committing murder, and had been stopped only by my willingness to cross a line that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. But the real trial had taken place in that moment when I chose to pull the trigger, when I decided that protecting the people I loved was more important than preserving whatever innocence I had left. Draven found me hours later in a federal holding cell, his presence filling the small space like smoke from a fire that had been burning since the beginning of time. And when he wrapped me in his arms and whispered that he was proud of me, that I had become everything he had known I could be, I understood that the woman who had answered the wrong phone call was truly dead, and that the woman who had taken her place was someone who could stand beside the Reaper himself and never flinch away from the darkness that lived in both their souls. The wedding that followed 6 months later was everything Draven had promised it would be. White flowers and witnesses who weren't carrying guns, and a church where the only violence was the kind of emotional devastation that comes from watching two damaged people pledge to love each other, despite all the reasons why they should run in opposite directions and never look back. My father walked me down the aisle, his acceptance of my choice and my new life written in every line of his face, and as I placed my hand in Draven's and spoke the words that would bind us together until death or federal prosecutors did us part, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the phone call that had changed everything, and the series of choices that had transformed me from a quiet book restorer into the queen of a criminal empire built on love and violence, and the unshakable certainty that some bonds are forged in fire and can never be broken. I'd answered the wrong phone call and found my true calling, not as the innocent girl who loved old books, but as the woman who wrote her own destiny in the shadows of the city. And if that destiny was written in blood and sealed with bullets, and blessed by a love that was dangerous enough to reshape the world, then so be it. Because I had learned that the most beautiful stories are often the ones that begin with a single mistake and end with the kind of transformation that makes angels out of demons and queens out of women who were brave enough to embrace the darkness and call it home.